Joseph Ledoux is a legendary American neuroscientist whose groundbreaking work has changed the landscape of brain research. He is a pioneer in the area of how emotion and memory work in the brain, and is also known for putting the amygdala in the spotlight. He is a professor at New York University, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and director of the Emotional Brain Institute. He is a best-selling author and the go-to expert on fear and anxiety, often quoted in publications such as The New York Times, Psychology Today, Rolling Stone, and Huffington Post. But not only is Ledoux a world-renowned scientist, he is also a musician, songwriter, performer, and recording artist.
I met him, I was so interested in his work, and the fact that he was a musician as well as a neuroscientist. I was really interested in neuroscience and he was really interested in music. We had a lot to talk about.
Joe is a major force in our field. He's been that almost from the time he entered it. The field would not be the same without Joe Ledoux.
Joe's main contribution is being a pioneer of the science of emotion. You know, when you're afraid, what Joe is doing is studying what happens in your brain when you're afraid, and how you can modify that and get over it, or work with that fear.
I first met Joe when he contacted me to appear with him at the Rubin Theater to discuss the brain and music.
If you look at the literature on the neuroscience of emotion, I don't think there's been a more influential scholar, scientist and thinker than Joe Ledoux. To this day, everyone's looking back to Joe's work. This has become an industry, I think, largely because of Joe.
Well, I grew up in Eunice, Louisiana, a small town in the Cajun Prairie. That's in the south part of Louisiana, French-speaking Cajun country. The town had about 10,000 people. It's a very rich musical culture, and also a very French Catholic kind of culture.
His parents had a butcher shop, and his father was a butcher. He was involved with everything from raising some of the cattle to slaughtering.
My father was the head butcher, and my mother was the meat wrapper and kind of the face of the business at the cash register. My job was to clean the brains. In particular, my job was to use my tiny little fingers to reach inside where the bullet wound was, because these animals were slaughtered with a gunshot. And so I would stick my fingers in there and I'm like, pull the bullet out, because people don't want to chomp down on lead when they're eating brains. So I did learn a bit of anatomy doing that. I didn't know what anything was called, but I had a visual picture of all these pieces. My high school graduation class had about, I think, 120 or so students in it. I went off to study business. It was the late 60s, so business was not something that was very cool. We kind of tried to keep it under the radar. I got more and more interested in psychology, and I took a course with a fellow that was studying the brain, studying rat brains and memory. And that was just like, wow, you can study the brain, And he'd taken me into his lab. I just fell in love with that and said, that's it, that's what I want to do. At the time, neuroscience was in its infancy. It was like it didn't really exist much. I mean, I think in 1972, the Society for Neuroscience was first formed. We're talking about 1971, 72, in that period when I was kind of getting into this. So it was really the early days. So you didn't really need to know much because not much was known. And today it would be impossible to kind of make that quick jump, because the kids now have to know biochemistry, neurophysiology, genetics. It's just like an impossible mountain of information that you have to acquire in order to even get into the graduate programs. All I had to do was have my professor at LSU, who knew this guy at Stony Brook, write to him, and I was admitted. It's a good thing, because no other school admitted me with my background. I got in at Stony Brook, and that's where I met Mike Gazzaniga, and we hit it off.
So I was a professor of psychology at Stony Brook, and Joseph arrived with a master's degree in marketing. And I just said, well, that's fine. The sense of adventure and risk-taking were evident in him. And those features usually predict a good outcome. And you want to spend time and you want to interact in every possible way, because they got the stuff.
Mike and I were studying patients who had their brain split in half, the connections between the two sides of the brain cut, in an effort to control debilitating epilepsy in people who had no other alternatives for treatment. The medications weren't working. And many of these patients were operated on at Dartmouth Medical School. And so we would drive up and test these patients. We had an orange Ford van, pumpkin colored, and a little camper trailer in the back that we'd converted into a laboratory.
And then we started driving around the hills of New Hampshire and Vermont, right up to patients' homes, and brought them out to the van, and we tested them. We had, in those days, it was pre-computer days. We basically brought a research lab to the hills of Vermont. The basic idea was you put information into one side of the brain, and the other side of the brain didn't seem to know about it after you had this basic hemisphere disconnection surgery.
The left hemisphere, having language, could talk about that information. The right hemisphere, not having language, couldn't talk about it, but could reach into a bag and say if you showed a picture of an apple to the right hemisphere, the left hand could pull it out and show that it had perceived it, but he couldn't talk about it. So there were all kinds of interesting questions about the relationship of language to consciousness itself, how it works. And Mike was a great mentor, and we were sitting at a bar in Bennington, Vermont, after having tested one of these patients and just kind of chatting about science and research and so forth. And he said, you know, there's not a lot of research on emotion going on in neuroscience these days. You ought to pursue that, because I had expressed some interest in that topic. And, you know, that was the point where the light bulb went off. And I said, yeah, that's what I'm going to do.
Emotion had a very primitive understanding back almost 50 years now, 45 years ago. While there was a lot of attention to memory, there was a lot of attention to various kinds of language disorders, there was a lot of attention to attention disorders. Really bringing emotion into the current scientific status it had really hadn't begun. And so it was very natural to say, you know, one of the big holes in our little enterprise here is really trying to understand emotion. There was no minute analysis of actual circuits involved. There was nothing that rose to the level of a sophisticated neuroscience, and the field needed attention. So he did it.
When I left Mike's lab, I didn't have access to all these wonderful patients anymore, and I had to figure out what I was going to do. I knew I wanted to study emotion, but I didn't quite know how I was going to do it. But I had a sense that, you know, I needed to turn away from humans and turn to animal research, because the techniques available back then just weren't very sophisticated for studying the human brain. You know, you could study patients with tumors or strokes and so forth, but it's a very crude kind of disruption of brain activity. It's very, you know, lots of areas are disrupted, and so it's not very precise. So to get to precision in terms of what the neural circuits were and how everything was working, I decided I needed to do that in animals.
Joe had a great mentor, Mike Zaniga, who was willing to let a student follow an idea where it led him. And it led Joe to the amygdala, and it led Joe to rodents, right? And that sort of started Joe's career.
When Joseph left and went in to study emotion, there was a limited understanding of how it might work in terms of neuromechanisms, and how any work working in the rat might actually help us understand the emotional system of humans. That's risk-taking. I mean, that was just cutting a new path on a new topic, and that's very hard to do. You're getting out of your lane, and the whole field of science is trying to keep you in your lane.
One of the big things in neuroscience at the time was the invertebrate work that Eric Kandel and others were doing, showing how a stimulus can be traced all the way through the simple invertebrate nervous system, from the sensory system that takes in the stimulus to the motor system that controls the response. The reason they were able to do it is because they had a very precise stimulus and a very precise response. And I thought, well, we can do that in the mammalian nervous system. If we have a simple stimulus and a simple kind of response, maybe we can trace the whole pathway from start to finish. So I kind of adopted that when I turned to rat research to study emotion. And I used a technique called Pavlovian fear conditioning, in which you have a simple stimulus, a tone, that's paired with a mild electric shock. You only have to do that one time. The next time the rat hears the tone, the stimulus will elicit changes in behavior, like freezing responses, and increases in blood pressure and heart rate. And this is kind of similar to what happens in a human. So rats and people are threatened by different things, but they respond very similarly. And so the rat research can tell us how things are working in the brain. Now, my strategy in approaching all this was really based on what you learn when you study split brain patients. That you have a stimulus, it goes in, it goes from area A to B to C, it crosses over. If you cut the connections between the sides of the brain, then the information can't flow. And so you really get the sense of stimuli moving through the brain in a very precise way. And so that's what I wanted to do in the rat research. It seemed like a kind of simple task. Start from the stimulus and follow it through the brain and figure out what connects the sensory system with the motor system. The basic concept was, you start with the stimulus and you measure a response. So you've got those two anchors. The stimulus has to be processed by the sensory system. For example, if it's a tone, it's got to go into the ear and through the auditory system. And the responses have to be controlled by a motor system to make the animal freeze or to change blood pressure and heart rate. So the tone goes into the ear, through the auditory system, and then it begins to connect with the motor system that controls the responses. And what we found was in between the sensory and the motor systems was this part of the brain called the amygdala. We didn't go looking for the amygdala. The pathway, the circuit, took us through the amygdala. And from that point on, we were able to identify exactly how the stimulus gets into the amygdala from the auditory system. The lateral nucleus of the amygdala receives that sensory information, not only from the auditory system, but from all other sensory systems. And it passes the information on to the central nucleus of the amygdala, which then connects up with all the motor systems, the freezing system, blood pressure system, heart rate system, stress hormone systems, and so forth. And a kind of response floodgate that's opened up, allowing all these responses to be expressed through different parts of the brain.
One of the things in his original work that he did was show that there was a subcortical, below the cortex, notion that information can come in and trigger emotional states for which the response is sort of automatic, and then the sort of cognitive part of yourself has to deal with this emotional eruption. And people have had those thoughts before, but proposing an actual brain mechanism, brain circuitry that might help to explain that really was new.
Now, other research, older research, had implicated the amygdala in emotional behavior, especially kind of fear-like behavior. But my work was the first to show how a stimulus gets to the amygdala, and together with other people that were beginning to work on this at the same time, how responses come out of the amygdala. And within a few years, we were able to connect the whole thing together from the starting point at the ear to the response control systems and the blood vessels and muscles, with the amygdala being the kind of hub of this network.
Joe's main contribution to neuroscience is putting a solid scientific basis on the study of emotion, period.
What Joe did is to work out the two key pathways that are important for learned fear. One is the direct pathway, whereby a stimulus immediately elicits a behavioral response, and the one that goes through the cerebral cortex and then leads to behavior, and that's the indirect pathway. So Joe provided the physiological anatomical basis for understanding fear.
There's many people now studying these threat learning associations who study the amygdala, who understand its importance in terms of emotion and the brain more broadly, that I think are directly descendants from Joe's intellectual contributions.
He said, let's do a real neuroscience on what emotional behavior might be. Let's find the circuits in the brain that are responsible for this. Let's see if we can dissociate it from other things. And he did that.
Joe's most important contribution is in taking something that we are not used to think about in biological terms or even scientific terms, like emotion. And he gave it a scientific foundation and a biological basis and something to study. And that made a huge difference in how we think about many domains of mental life and how we think about mental disorders.
What that means is that people who are worried about emotional disorders, and that's a vast problem, now can call upon a scientific understanding of the issue to see how aid might be generated.
He really laid the foundation for understanding how the brain learns the things in the world that are potentially threatening to us. Like, how is it we walk around in the world and know that this is something to avoid, this is something potentially dangerous. That's something that's really important to understand for both survival, but critically it's important to understand for emotional disorders, because from a lot of emotional disorders, the problem is you think things are threatening to you when they're not. And so Joe's work is the foundation of understanding how those processes work right and how they work wrong.
So Joseph's work, I think, opened the door to really putting sound scientific knowledge to all these things. And it's a rich and lively field now with lots of people in it, lots of ideas. But so much of that is based on knowing you can have specific neurophysiologic, neuroanatomical models of what's going on.
So from this early work identifying all the parts of the amygdala and so forth, eventually it became clear to me that the amygdala was not the seat of fear. It was simply detecting the stimulus, the threatening stimulus, and controlling the response to that stimulus through the body. People with amygdala damage can still experience fear and anxiety. So fear is not coming out of the amygdala. I'm so often associated with the idea that the amygdala is the seat of fear in the brain. And so what gets lost is that distinction between the feeling of fear and the detection and responding to threat. The feeling of fear is not what causes the behavioral responses. Fear is a conscious awareness that you're in danger. We don't have a fear system, a fear circuit in our brain. We have defense circuits, thermoregulatory circuits, eating circuits, and so forth. All of these can make us feel fearful or anxious. They can also, many of them can also make us feel pleasure. What we feel is cognitively constructed in our brains on the basis of certain non-conscious ingredients that are put together. The brain is processing what that stimulus is. That stimulus at the same time is going into the brain, triggering memories that you may have about past events with that stimulus. As a child, you begin to learn certain facts about experiences. You learn that in a situation where your heart is beating fast and there's some stimulus that someone has told you is a source of danger, you now begin to feel fear, because when you were very young, your parents may have said, "Oh, you must have been so afraid when you saw that snake." And you begin to categorize or build up these catalogs of experiences. These kinds of things are fear experiences. So your brain is processing the image of the snake and creating a representation of that. That representation is going to memory systems, retrieving memories that you have of experiences you may have had with snakes, or just facts you know about snakes, that they're reptiles, that they're dangerous, and so forth. So these things are beginning to coalesce in consciousness into a cognitive kind of consciousness. There's no emotion there at this point because it's just perception and memory. Now, the emotion begins to come when the consequences of activating the defense system are happening at the same time. So in addition to creating a perceptual representation and a memory representation, the threat is also going to the amygdala, activating the so-called arousal systems of the brain that increase alertness and attention to the environment. Because of this, the attention is now focused on that snake. Based on the sensory stimulus, the memory about that stimulus in the past, the fact that your defense system is aroused and causing your heart to beat fast and so forth, the fact that you've activated a schema of fear because you know that snakes are dangerous in a cold cognitive sense, all of that is now coming together in your mind in a kind of workspace of the mind called working memory, where it all comes together as fear. Anxiety is constructed much the same as fear. The difference is that the stimulus is often internal. There's not a threat that is immediately present. It could be a thought or a memory that's triggering all of these processes. The external trigger, if it's a threat, will elicit fear. But if it elicits a thought that then leads to a worry, then it's triggering anxiety. You know, we often say the amygdala, but there's actually two of them, and some people don't realize that. But every structure in the brain is double, one on each side. So where is the amygdala? It's pretty easy to figure out. If I take this pencil and put it into my eye and this one into my ear and push them all the way in, where they meet would be roughly where the amygdala is.
When it comes to the field of emotion and the brain, Joe has always been some of an intellectual leader.
He's not a robotic guy who's just trying to figure out the circuits of the brain. He's trying to figure out mental states. And one of his tools is neuroscience, and another one of his tools is writing and music. He has this rich other life of being involved in music, and that's just not a common thing.
You know, when Joe was in high school, he was already really devoted to music.
When you grow up around so much music and in a culture that is focused on music, it's just literally everywhere. You walk through Main Street and every store has music coming out from the store through a speaker on the sidewalk. You know, it's just part of your kind of quote, DNA that when you grow up like that. I was a disc jockey in high school because I really wanted to be involved in presenting music as well as listening to it. And also in bands in high school because I wanted to make the music. My main high school band was called the Countdowns. I was the rhythm guitar player. I guess I played a bit through college. Actually, we had a kind of quick band. Only performed once, but it was called Cerebellum and the Medullas. Now, this was long before I knew anything about the brain, long before I even thought I would have a band with another brain area name. But it sort of dropped out of my life when Nancy and I got married and we started having a family. In 1987, we had our first son, Jacob. 1990, Milo was born, our second son. The pressure of being a young professional academic trying to make his way through the science world. And music is one thing that just kind of fell between the cracks. Raising children and all those other things took priority. Guitar playing kind of slipped out of the picture. But our older son, Jacob, picked up guitar when he was in his adolescence and became very interested in music and guitar and took guitar lessons. And he and I actually shared a teacher, Jeff Pretz.
Joe gave me a phone call and he had mentioned that he played guitar too. We kind of hit it off just personally. I gave Jacob a bunch of lessons and then even wound up giving Joe a few lessons. I kind of taught privately in their home, and then that's when I would finish with Jacob and Joe would be like there with his guitar. Can I learn something too?
Milo had a different set of interests. He was more into language and probably got some of that from Nancy, her being a writer. So Milo went on to study classics when he went off to college. Jacob unfortunately passed away at an early age. He had a problem with drug addiction and had a heroin overdose.
Joe's son Jacob was good friends with several of my other students, and they were, in high school, and they were experimenting with the things people do in high school and taking it a little too far. I know Jacob's death was an accident. He was a very smart kid. He was very athletic. He was kind of good at everything, and then he just made a mistake that there was no coming back from.
So when Jacob died, I found music to be very healing and therapeutic in a sense, and started playing guitar again, listening to music quite a bit at that point, and actually wrote a few songs at that point.
The biggest change in Joe musically after Jacob's passing was it became a creative outlet, not so much just a hobby. And Joe's music career is kind of born out of this, and I think a big part of it is, it's the way that Joe still connects with Jacob. Immediately after Jacob passed, Joe started to write.
Yeah, that song reminds me of you and all the things that we used to do.
Then I met Tyler Volk, and we became good friends, buddies in playing guitar, and we used to play around NYU. And we ended up forming a band that became the Amygdaloids, in which I started doing all the songwriting about mind and brain and mental disorders. That became our genre. And that is what we did the rest of our musical career as the Amygdaloids. The Amygdaloids had their formal beginning on November 1st, 2006, when we played at Union Hall in Brooklyn. Tyler Vogt and I were good friends, and we're both book writers and both Stratocaster players, so we've been playing together for a while. Daniela Schiller was a postdoc with me and Liz Phelps at the time. She played drums, so she joined us. Nina Curley, her research assistant, also joined us to play bass. All 4 band members were scientists, and so we marched off to Union Hall and played some songs about mind and brain and mental disorders. And the audience kind of reacted well to the 2 original songs. The rest of our set was songs also about mind and brain and mental disorders. So we played 19th Nervous Breakdown, Mother's Little Helper, Manic Depression, and on, great 60s hits. And turns out that, most rock songs are love songs about mind and brain and mental disorders. So it was a kind of natural fit for us in a way. There was a newspaper article about the show in the Long Island newspaper Newsday that came out, I think the day before the show. And the title of the blurb was Heavy Mental. And so that became our sort of calling card and became the title of our first album.
If you have bass and drums and guitar and a lead singer that writes the music, suddenly we became a band. And that's how our journey started. And it worked well, so we just continued. Because we were a science band, it somehow connected well with people, and it was something that people could easily connect with and grasp and show interest in.
When I started working with him, helping him with his home studio, I became aware that he was, connected with NYU, and then when he told me about his band, at that point, it was not just that he was a neuroscientist, his whole band was neuroscientists. It was certainly the first all neuroscientist band that I'd worked with.
From the very beginning of his commitment to really bringing the music into the public, he was interested in using the music to talk about issues in brain research and also around questions of mental health issues.
What he's done is take academic insight and bring it back into very accessible music.
There's a saying that goes, it ain't rocket science, it's rock and roll. Well, it ain't neuroscience, it's rock and roll. But in a way, they kind of collide, especially with the Amygdaloids.
My mom said no, 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 no.
Just the inspiration came from science. So it wasn't like an educational song that the words are the most important thing and you kind of use the music as an excuse almost. It was really primarily about writing music. But what made it unique is that it really was inspired by the content of science and philosophy of mind, and these are really beautiful concepts if you think about it.
Fear learning is rapid and persistent. While fear memories can be controlled, they are hard to eliminate.
We were very lucky early on to have a couple of filmmakers be willing to help us make some music videos. Noah Hutton did one called Fearing. The song was an Emily Dickinson song that I turned into kind of a spooky song about fear and anxiety. And we shot that up in the Catskills in an old barn.
If recollecting or forgetting, then I remember not. If forgetting, recollecting, how nearly I forgot.
I think it's been wonderful for him in terms of pursuing a dream he's always had. It's been great in terms of the people that he's met.
So one of the pleasures of this musical adventure I've been on is to meet some fantastic musicians like Lenny Kaye, Roseanne Cash, Steve Wynn, and many others. Lenny and I actually did a performance together at the Rubin Museum. Lenny is the guitarist for the Patti Smith Group. And we had a discussion about music, the brain, neuroscience, and we just had a great time, played some music, some songs I picked out, some songs he picked out about mind and brain.
The duo that we made, we kind of interviewed each other and then performed some music centered around the brain. But we tried to illustrate our conversation by playing a few songs. And it was nice to see Joe, an academic of the highest caliber, play. Music, as we know, is very intuitive and gets to parts of the brain that often logic misses.
Lenny and Steve Wynn also played with us at a record release for our album Theory of My Mind. And it was a fun experience with lots of musicians. We had a cello player, we had a sax player in the band at the time. So it was a really big band. Roseanne was interested in meeting me because she had had a brain tumor and brain surgery. And I was interested in meeting her because she's Roseanne Cash.
We met, we stayed in touch, we were, intrigued by each other. He let me know he was going to make a record. I said, you're making a record? And he said, yeah, I got this band, the Amygdaloids, which I thought was really funny. I was familiar with what the amygdala was before I heard that his band was called the Amygdaloids, because I've had a long time interest in neuroscience. And I had brain surgery in 2007, and then I really got more interested in it. And then, of course, he asked me to sing on his record. I didn't expect that. I sang on a couple songs. It was fun.
Honestly, the music part was a little bit bait and switch. I thought I was marrying a scientist and an academic, and then after some time had passed, I discovered I was married to, a rock and roller, and I was gonna be carrying his gig bag and be, one of the groupies. It's been fun. I think Joe will continue to make music and play music, listen to music for as long as he can hold a guitar. That's going to keep on going.
My new music project is with Colin Dempsey, an Irish folk singer, and we have an acoustic duo called So We Are. If you look into my mind's eye,
But Joseph, you got to remember that he's a highly talented guy. And I've always thought that when he goes home and tries to introspect, he's really introspecting on what it means to feel and have the many emotions that he feels. We're all dealing with felt states all day long. How does that work? And he ponders this thing, and he ponders it through music, he ponders it through writing, and he ponders it through his science. And that's just a rare. To see all of that, and it's always trying to get at this question, I think, of how and why do we feel the way we feel? And that's kind of the fundamental question for all of us in the brain science, trying to figure out ultimately this thing called consciousness and our vast array of emotions we feel all day long.
We often think of emotions as the causes of our behavioral responses, like moving away from danger. But when you trace it back all the way, you see that this ability arose long before there was anything like an emotion, even before there was a nervous system. Bacterial cells have no nervous system. So the ability to detect and respond to danger is as old as life itself. So that principle, that concept, seemed very interesting to me, and so I decided to write a book about it called The Deep History of Ourselves, where I trace the whole history of life and show how behavior has been there from the beginning and then becomes more complex as organisms get more complex, ultimately also being paralleled with a kind of sense of an awareness that you're behaving in a certain way, in other words, consciousness, including conscious feelings. So feelings didn't arise to make the behavior. Feelings arose as a way to perhaps monitor and control the behavior. We know that people respond to threats. We know that rats respond to threats. Even invertebrates will respond to danger. If you start looking at research on protozoa like paramecium, they will move away from danger. And if you go even further back into bacteria, they also move away from danger. So it all of a sudden dawned on me that the ability to detect and respond to danger has nothing to do with emotions. It's really about just survival. It's what a cell needs to do to survive, whether that cell is a single cell living on its own, like a bacterial cell, or whether it's a complex organism made of lots of cells like us. And so really what it seems like is that the ability to detect and respond to danger was part of the first survival response of the first cells that ever existed 4 billion years ago. So I don't know how much longer I'm going to do research. I've collected a lot of data over the years that I've been doing this, and I'm sort of leaning more now towards the idea that I need to step back and reevaluate what we've done and try to make sense of it. And I've started to do that. So I think that's where I want to go and think about how systems in the brain work together rather than how individual systems function. How does the self come out of the brain, for example, is an issue I think is really important. And there's been some work on that in neuroscience, but I think we still don't have a good understanding of it. The role of language in emotion and personality and self, I think, is very important. I think I probably want to pursue more philosophical issues. I have collaborations with some philosophers now, and we're trying to get into the deep questions about how consciousness works, not just emotional consciousness, but consciousness in general. And I think emotions have a unique perspective to add to consciousness research. And so, I'll just see where everything goes by taking an open mind approach.